The phone rang at 11:47 p.m., and Caleb Walker almost didn't answer it. When he did, the voice on the other end wasn't asking for help. It was giving an order. I need you standing beside me in 9 days in a room full of people who destroyed me, and I need you to not say a word about why. That was how Victoria Langley, a woman worth $400 million, a woman who had never once needed anyone, asked a broke Navy veteran and single father to walk with her back into the one place she swore she'd never return to. He didn't know yet that this wasn't a favor. It was a war he was about to be drafted into. If you're watching this from Ohio, Texas, Florida, Georgia, drop your state in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels tonight. And if you believe a person's worth isn't measured by the size of their bank account, hit subscribe, because Caleb Walker is about to prove that to an entire room of people who think they already know the answer. The garage smelled like motor oil and old coffee, and that was exactly how Caleb Walker liked it. Underneath the lift flat on his back on the creeper, he had a wrench in one hand and a headlamp strapped crooked over his brow, and for the last 40 minutes the only thing on his mind had been the stubborn bolt on a 2016 Silverado's oil pan. That was the whole appeal of this job. Nobody asked him questions down here. Nobody looked at him twice. He was just a mechanic in a stained blue jumpsuit named Frank's Auto on the chest pocket. Even though his name wasn't Frank, and never had been, the shirts were second-hand, and he wore what fit. His phone buzzed against the concrete floor beside him. He ignored it. Buzzed again. He let out a breath through his nose, set the wrench down, and slid out from under the truck. 6 missed calls. Same number. Unknown. But he recognized the area code corporate downtown, the kind of number that usually meant a collections agency, or a wrong number. He almost didn't pick up the 7th time it rang. "Walker," he said, wiping his hand on a rag before he even had the phone to his ear. "Mr. Walker, this is Victoria Langley." He stood there for a second, genuinely unsure if he'd heard that right. Victoria Langley, CEO of Langley Dynamics. The woman whose face had been on the cover of a business magazine his daughter had brought home from the school library because they were doing a unit on influential women in industry. He remembered because Emma had pointed at the photo and said, "Dad, she looks like she could fire the sun." "I think you have the wrong number," Caleb said slowly. "I don't." Her voice was even controlled, the kind of voice that had never once had to raise itself to be obeyed. "You did 2 tours as a Navy corpsman. You were honorably discharged 4 years ago. You've been raising your daughter alone since your wife passed. You currently work at a garage on Route 9. And before that, you turned down a private security contract in Dubai because you didn't want to leave your daughter for 8 months at a time." Caleb's jaw tightened. "You had somebody look into me." "I did." "Why?" There was a pause on the line, just long enough that Caleb almost thought the call had dropped. "I need someone to accompany me to an event," she finally said. 9 days from now. It would require your full attention for the evening. I would compensate you accordingly enough to cover your daughter's tuition for the next 2 years if that matters to you." Caleb's stomach did something complicated. Anger, mostly. The kind that came from a stranger knowing exactly where the soft spot was and pressing on it without apology. "You don't know anything about my daughter's tuition. I know she attends Brookfield Elementary on a partial scholarship that expires next year," Victoria said. "I know the private middle school you want to send her to costs $11,000 a year. I know you've been picking up double shifts on weekends to save for it, and you're still $4,000 short. Lady, I don't know who you are to me, but you need to—" "I'm not your enemy, Mr. Walker. I'm someone asking for a favor and willing to pay generously for it. That's all this is." Caleb walked to the open garage door, looked out at the gray afternoon, the cars going by on Route 9, like nothing in the world was strange. "What kind of event?" "A wedding." "Whose—" Another pause. Shorter this time, but heavier. "Mine wasn't." Caleb frowned. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I'm giving you today," Victoria said. "If you want to know more, meet me tomorrow. There's a coffee shop on 6th and Main, 10 a.m. If you're not interested, don't come. I won't call again." The line went dead before he could respond. Caleb stood in the garage doorway for a long moment, phone still against his ear, even though there was nothing left to hear but silence. Behind him, his coworker Danny leaned against a tool cabinet, chewing a toothpick like he had all day to watch Caleb have a crisis. "Everything all right, man?" "I don't know," Caleb said honestly. "I think I just got recruited." That night, after Emma was asleep, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and did what he always did when something didn't add up. He wrote it down like a debrief. Who, what, why, risk. Under, who he wrote. Victoria Langley, CEO Langley. Dynamics. Old family money, self-made empire on top of it. Never married, no public relationships. Known for being cold in negotiations. Ruthless per articles. Under, what he wrote wants me at a wedding. 9 days out. Paying enough to cover Emma's tuition. Under, why he just stared at the paper for a long time before writing unknown. Doesn't add up. Rich people don't need strangers. They need someone who won't talk. Under risk. He wrote nothing at all because he already knew the honest answer was everything, and he wasn't ready to put that down on paper yet. His phone buzzed, a text from his sister Marissa, the only family he still talked to regularly. "You good? You've been weird all week." He typed back, "Got offered a strange job. Might tell you about it if I take it. Strange how rich stranger wants me to be her +1 at a wedding. Paying enough for Emma's school." There was a delay before the next text came through, and when it did, it was exactly the response he expected. "Caleb, that is either the setup to a scam or the setup to a movie. There is no in between." He almost laughed. Almost. He looked toward the hallway, toward Emma's door, cracked open the way she liked it, because she still didn't love complete darkness, not since her mother died. 8 years old, and already she'd had to learn how to be brave in rooms too big and too quiet. $4,000 short. That was the number that kept surfacing, no matter how many times he tried to push it down. $4,000 stood between his daughter and a school with actual art classes, actual counselors, actual teachers who didn't have 40 kids in one room. He'd told himself 100 times that public school was fine, that it would be fine that plenty of good people came out of schools with peeling paint and underfunded libraries. He still believed that. But he also knew what it looked like when Emma came home talking about the Smart Kids program she wasn't in this year because the school had to cut it. He wasn't doing this for himself. That was the only thing he was sure of walking into that coffee shop the next morning. She was already there when he arrived 5 minutes early on purpose because he didn't like walking into a room where someone else had the advantage of watching him enter. But Victoria Langley had beaten him to it anyway, sitting at a corner table with her back to the wall, a habit Caleb recognized because it was his own habit too. People who'd learned not to be surprised sat with their backs to the wall. She looked up as he approached, and for a moment neither of them said anything. She was younger than her professional photos suggested, maybe late 30s, dressed in charcoal gray, not flashy. Nothing about her screaming wealth, except the quiet confidence of someone who never had to check a price tag. Her eyes were the kind that assessed a person quickly and didn't apologize for it. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Sit." "Ms. Langley?" He sat, but he didn't relax. "You've got about 5 minutes before I decide this isn't worth my time." Something flickered across her face, not quite a smile, but close to respect. Fair enough. She slid a folder across the table. He didn't open it. "Talk first," he said. "I don't sign anything until I understand what I'm signing up for." "You're not signing anything today. This is a conversation." "Then have it." Victoria folded her hands on the table. 9 days from now, Evelyn Whitmore is marrying into the Ashcombe family. It's being called the wedding of the decade in 3 different society columns already. 400 guests, senators, old money, new money pretending to be old money, cameras from 2 magazines. Okay, Evelyn Whitmore was my fiancée. Victoria's voice didn't change pitch, didn't waver, but something in her posture stiffened, like she was bracing for a hit that hadn't landed yet. We were together for 6 years, engaged for 2 of them. She left me for exactly the kind of family she's marrying into now, the kind with a name that opens doors mine despite everything I've built, apparently still can't. Caleb sat with that for a second. And you're going to her wedding. I have to. My presence or my absence will be read as a statement either way. If I don't go, it confirms every rumor that I couldn't handle it, that I'm still broken over her, that she won. If I go alone, I walk into a room of 400 people who will spend the entire night deciding whether I look pathetic or dignified, and I refuse to let strangers decide that about me. So you want a date? I want a shield, Victoria said, and for the first time her voice had an edge in it, something raw underneath the polish. I want someone standing next to me who cannot be intimidated by money, because he's never needed it to know his own worth. I want someone who will not flinch when people whisper because he's spent his life being underestimated and has never once let it break him. I researched a dozen men before I called you Mr. Walker. Executives, actors. One senator's aide who does this professionally, believe it or not. I didn't choose any of them. Why not? Because they would have performed for the room. You won't. You don't know how to fake composure, you actually have it. That's rarer than money. And money is the only thing that room understands, so I need to bring something it doesn't. Caleb studied her for a long moment. There was something underneath the CEO voice, underneath the $400 million, something that looked, if he was being honest, a lot like the face his daughter made the week after her mother's funeral, when she'd insisted she was fine, and then cried alone in the bathroom because she didn't want him to see. You could hire an actor for this, he said. Somebody who does exactly what you're describing for a living. I don't want a performance, I want a person. You don't know me. I know enough, Victoria said. I know you carried a wounded Marine 400 yards under fire in Kandahar and never once mentioned it to anyone outside your unit. It's in your service record, not in any interview, because you never gave one. I know you buried your wife and didn't miss a single day of work the following week because you didn't want to lose the job that was keeping your daughter insured. I know men who've never had a fraction of your character and twice your money, and I am done surrounding myself with them. The garage noise of Caleb's ordinary life, the bolts, the oil changes. The $4,000 suddenly felt very far away from this conversation and very close to it at the same time. What exactly would I need to do? Stand beside me. Speak when spoken to. Don't react to provocation, because there will be provocation. Evelyn's world specializes in it. Elegant cruelty disguised as small talk. And don't ask me questions about her in front of anyone. What happens between us stays between us. That's it. That's it. One evening. You'll be paid $40,000 regardless of how the night goes. Caleb sat back. $40,000 was more than 3 times what he'd calculated he needed. It wasn't just tuition anymore. It was tuition and a car that didn't threaten to die every winter, and maybe for the first time in 4 years, a summer, where he wasn't counting every dollar before it left his hand. Why me specifically? He said again because the number had made him suspicious instead of grateful. You said you researched a dozen men. What made me the one you called? Victoria was quiet for a moment, and when she answered, her voice had lost some of its polish. I watched a video. Local news 2 years ago. A house fire on your street. You ran in before the fire department arrived and pulled out an elderly neighbor you'd never even mentioned, knowing well. And when the reporter asked why you did it, you said, because nobody else was going to, Caleb finished quietly. He remembered that night. He hadn't thought about it in a long time. That's the man I need standing next to me in that room, Victoria said. Somebody who does the right thing because nobody else is going to and doesn't need an audience to do it. Caleb looked down at the folder still sitting unopened between them. Inside he assumed were contracts ND, as maybe photographs of the venue. All the machinery of a world he didn't belong to. I need to think about it, he said. I've got a daughter. I don't make decisions like this alone anymore. Understood? Victoria stood smoothing the front of her coat, and for a moment the CEO mask slid fully back into place, as if the conversation that had just happened belonged to someone else entirely. You have 2 days. After that, I'll need to find someone else. She left cash on the table for both their coffees before he could object, and walked out without looking back. Caleb sat there for a long time after she left, staring at the folder, not touching it. He didn't open the folder until Emma was in bed that night. He sat at the kitchen table with a beer he didn't drink and read through 11 pages of legal language that boiled down to exactly what Victoria had told him at the coffee shop, plus one detail she hadn't mentioned out loud: a strict confidentiality clause that would remain in effect for 5 years after the event, regardless of whether he took the job. He also found photographs, not of the venue, of Evelyn Whitmore. She was beautiful in the specific engineered way that came from a lifetime of the best of everything: the best doctors, the best stylists, the best schools that taught you how to smile in photographs without ever showing teeth. In one picture dated years back, she stood beside a much younger, softer-looking Victoria Langley, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. It was the only photo in the folder where Victoria looked like she wasn't performing anything for anyone. Caleb closed the folder. He thought about his late wife Rachel, and the year before she got sick when they'd gone to her cousin's wedding, and Rachel had cried during the vows, not out of sadness, but because weddings had always undone something soft in her, some belief that love was still possible to promise out loud in front of people. He wondered what kind of wedding Victoria and Evelyn would have had if things had gone differently. He wondered if Victoria still thought about that sometimes, in whatever version of nighttime existed for someone who ran an empire. His phone buzzed. Marissa again. Well, did the rich stranger explain herself? He typed slowly. It's her ex-fiancée's wedding. She doesn't want to walk in alone. Oh my God, Caleb. That's not a job. That's a decoy mission. You're not a +1, you're camouflage. I know. And you're considering it. He looked toward Emma's door again. Cracked open the hallway light spilling gently across her floor. $40,000, Marissa. That's her school paid for years. That's a car that won't die on me in February. That's breathing room I haven't had since Rachel died. There was a longer pause this time before his sister responded. Then do it. But Caleb, be careful. Rich people's wars aren't like ours. Nobody bleeds, but everybody gets used. He set the phone down and sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time, the folder closed in front of him, the beer going flat and untouched. He thought about the word Victoria had used. Shield. Not partner, not friend. Shield something you stood behind, something built to absorb impact, so the person behind it didn't have to. He'd been a shield before professionally for men whose names he still remembered on nights he couldn't sleep. He knew what it cost to be that for someone. He knew the weight of standing in front of an attack that wasn't aimed at you personally, but landed on you anyway. But he also knew what it looked like from the other side, what it looked like to walk into a room of people who'd already decided who you were before you opened your mouth. He'd lived that as a kid too, growing up the son of a mechanic in a town that made sure you knew exactly where you ranked. He knew how to survive being underestimated. Maybe that was the actual qualification Victoria Langley had been looking for, whether she realized it or not. He called her the next morning before he'd even finished his coffee. I'm in, he said when she picked up. One condition. Name it. You tell me everything. Not the folder version. The real version, what actually happened between you two. What I'm walking into, who's likely to come at me and why. I don't do blind ops anymore. Haven't since I got out. If I'm your shield, I need to know what I'm shielding you from. There was a pause, and then quieter than he expected. All right, come to my office tomorrow evening. I'll tell you everything. Her office occupied the top 2 floors of a glass building downtown, the kind of place where the elevator required a key card just to select the right button. Caleb had worn his best button-down, the one he saved for parent-teacher conferences and funerals, And even that felt wrong the moment the elevator doors opened onto floor 41. Victoria was waiting for him in a conference room with a wall of windows overlooking the city at dusk, sitting with 2 glasses of water, already poured, no assistant in sight. "Sit," she said, and this time it didn't sound like a command, so much as an invitation to something she clearly didn't extend often. Caleb sat. "Tell me." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the skyline instead of at him. "Evelyn and I met in college. She wasn't from money, then not real money anyway. Comfortable, but not this." She gestured vaguely at the room around them, at the version of wealth neither of them had grown up inside. "We built things together. I started the company with money I borrowed against my grandmother's house. Evelyn worked 2 jobs those first 3 years, so we could afford the office space. She believed in me before anyone else did. What happened? Success happened," Victoria said, and there was no bitterness in it, just exhaustion, the kind that came from replaying something too many times. "The company grew. I started getting invited to rooms she wasn't invited into. Boards, galas, places where I was suddenly the interesting one, and she was the girlfriend standing at the edge of the photo. I didn't see it happening in real time. I was too busy building. By the time I noticed how far apart we'd drifted, she'd already met Warren Ashcombe at a fundraiser I was too consumed with work to attend. And he offered her something you couldn't. He offered her a name that didn't require building anything," Victoria said. "The Ashcombes have been powerful for 4 generations. Nobody in that family has ever had to prove they belonged in a room. Evelyn spent 6 years watching me prove it over and over, and I think somewhere along the way, she got tired of being proof of nothing herself." Caleb turned his glass of water slowly on the table, not drinking it. "That's not really about money, though, is it?" Victoria looked at him surprised. "What do you mean? You said you were too busy building. Sounds to me like she left because she felt invisible, not because she wanted a bigger house." Something crossed Victoria's face, not quite offense, but close to it. The reflex of someone who wasn't used to being read that accurately by a stranger. "You're not wrong," she admitted after a moment. "I've had 4 years to think about it, and you're not wrong. I built an empire and lost the one person who believed in me before I had anything to show for it. There's a particular kind of stupid in that, Mr. Walker." "Caleb," he said. "If we're doing this, you can call me Caleb." "Caleb." She said it carefully, like testing the shape of it. "The wedding is at the Ashcombe estate. It's not just a wedding, it's a coronation in a way. Evelyn marrying in means the Ashcombes absorb whatever remains of her family's reputation, and she gets the name she's wanted her whole life. Everyone who matters in this city will be there. Everyone who's ever doubted me, and everyone who's ever wondered if I'm still in love with a woman who left me for someone else's last name." "Are you?" Caleb asked, quiet, not unkind. Victoria took a long moment before answering. "I don't know anymore. I know I'm angry. I know I'm tired of people asking me about her in interviews I never agreed to give personal answers in. I know that if I walk into that wedding alone, every person in that room will spend the whole night deciding I'm either bitter or broken, and I refuse to give them the satisfaction of either. So instead I'm bringing someone they can't categorize," Victoria said. "You don't fit their world, Caleb. You won't perform for them, you won't compete with them, and you genuinely won't care what they think of you, because your life has never depended on their approval. That unsettles people like that more than any amount of money could." Caleb sat with that. Outside the window, the city lights were coming up against the darkening sky, and somewhere out there, his daughter was probably finishing her homework at the kitchen table, completely unaware that her father was sitting 41 floors up, agreeing to walk into a war that wasn't his. "There's something else," Victoria said, and her voice dropped lower, more careful. "Evelyn will try to get to you. Not romantically, she's not interested in that. She'll try to unsettle you, make you feel out of place, because if she can make you crack, it proves I brought someone beneath me, and that reflects on my judgment, not just yours. She's very good at that. Elegant humiliation is practically a skill she was raised to master. I've survived worse than a rich woman's insults," Caleb said. "I believe you. But I need you to understand what you're walking into before you agree to it fully. This isn't a fun night out, Caleb. This is a battlefield with better lighting and worse weapons words instead of bullets, but they can still do damage if you're not ready. Caleb thought about every room he'd ever walked into where people had already decided who he was before he spoke recruiters' offices, that assumed a mechanic's kid wouldn't test well. Hospital waiting rooms where nurses assumed a single father didn't know his own daughter's medical history job interviews after his discharge. Where men in suits looked at his service record like it was a liability, instead of proof he'd already survived things they couldn't imagine. I've spent my whole life in rooms like that, he said. Just without the chandeliers. Something in Victoria's expression softened, just slightly, just for a second, before the composed mask slid back into place. Then we have an agreement, she said, extending her hand across the table. Caleb shook it. Her grip was firm, controlled, but he noticed or thought he noticed the faintest tremor underneath it gone almost as soon as it appeared. One more thing, he said, not letting go right away. If this is a war, I need to know the terrain. Who's actually going to be a threat in that room? Not just Evelyn. Who else? Victoria exhaled, and for the first time all evening, she looked less like a CEO and more like a person bracing for something she couldn't control. Warren Ashcomb's mother, Constance, runs that family with more precision than most generals run armies. She'll be polite to your face and lethal in every sentence underneath it. There's also my father. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Your father's going to be there. He's an old friend of the Ashcombe patriarch. He'll be there representing the family name, and he's never approved of anything I've built without his permission first. Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was the one who told me 4 years ago that Evelyn leaving was the natural correction of an unnatural arrangement. I haven't spoken to him since except for business necessities. Caleb absorbed that quietly. There it was, the real shape of what he was walking into. Not just an ex-fiancée's wedding, but a woman's entire history of being told she didn't belong converging in one room on one night, and she was choosing to face all of it at once instead of hiding from any piece of it. Okay, he said simply. Okay, I understand what I'm walking into. And okay, I'm still in. He finally released her hand. But I need you to understand something too. I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not in that room. I'm not going to fake polish I don't have, or pretend I know which fork is for what. If people underestimate me, that's their mistake to make, not mine to fix. I'll stand beside you. I'll protect what needs protecting. But I'm walking in as exactly who I am. For the first time since he'd met her, Victoria Langley actually smiled, small, brief, but real. That, she said, is precisely why I chose you. Done. The next 9 days moved strangely, the way time does when you know something significant is coming, and every ordinary moment starts to feel like it's on borrowed time. Caleb kept working at the garage because he didn't know how else to fill his hands, and because Emma's routine mattered more to him than anything happening on floor 41 of a glass building downtown. But the nights were different. Victoria called twice, briefing him on names he'd need to recognize, small rules of a world he'd never navigated, who to call sir, who not to bother with small talk, how to hold a wine glass at a cocktail hour without looking like he was gripping a wrench. He absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, methodically, without complaint, treating it like mission prep because that was the only framework his mind knew how to use for something this unfamiliar. On the 5th night, Emma found him at the kitchen table, with a printed list of names Victoria had sent the Ashcombes' extended family, arranged by importance like a briefing document. What's that? Emma asked, climbing onto the chair across from him, still in her pajamas, hair damp from her bath. Homework, Caleb said, folding the paper before she could read too much of it. You don't have homework, Dad. You're a grown-up. Grown-ups get homework too sometimes. It's just a different kind. Emma studied him with the particular seriousness only an 8-year-old could manage, the kind of look that made him feel like she could see straight through every deflection he tried. Is it about the wedding lady? Caleb blinked. How do you know about that? Aunt Marissa was talking to you on the phone, and I heard some of it. She said you were going to a fancy wedding with a rich lady. Emma tilted her head. Are you going to marry her? Caleb laughed despite himself, the tension of the last 9 days breaking for just a moment. No, baby, it's not like that. She just needs someone to stand next to her at an important event, and she's paying me to do it. It's a job. Is it a scary job? He thought about how to answer that honestly without frightening her. It's a different kind of scary than what I'm used to, he admitted. Nobody's shooting at me. But some people might not be very nice to me, because I'm not like the other people who'll be there. Emma considered this with the gravity of a child who had already learned far too young that unfairness existed in the world and didn't always make sense. Like when kids at school were mean because I get free lunch. Caleb's chest tightened. He hadn't known she was aware of that, hadn't known it had registered as clearly as it apparently had. Kind of like that, he said quietly. Except grown-up mean is usually quieter. It doesn't yell. It just makes you feel small without saying anything obviously wrong. That sounds worse, Emma said with the blunt clarity only children possessed. Sometimes it is. What are you going to do if they're mean to you? Caleb thought about that question longer than he expected to. He thought about every room he'd ever survived by refusing to let someone else's opinion decide his worth. He thought about Rachel and how she used to say that dignity wasn't loud. It was just steady, the same in a boardroom as it was in a broken-down kitchen, with the power about to get shut off. I'm going to remember that I know who I am, he finally said, even if they don't. Emma nodded slowly, like that was a perfectly reasonable strategy, and then reached across the table and patted his hand the way he usually did for her. You're the bravest dad I know, she said entirely without irony, entirely without knowing what that sentence would come to mean to him in the days ahead. He didn't sleep much that night. Not out of fear exactly, he'd walked into far more dangerous rooms than a wedding reception and come out the other side. It was something else keeping him up, something closer to responsibility. He wasn't just protecting himself in that room. He was in some strange and unplanned way about to become the shield for a woman who had built an empire and still hadn't figured out how to stop bracing for the moment someone decided she didn't belong in her own life. He understood that feeling better than she probably realized. 3 days before the wedding, Victoria called him to a tailor shop on a street Caleb had never had reason to walk down before, the kind of block where every storefront looked more like a museum exhibit than a place of business. The tailor, an older man named Mr. Petrosian, measured Caleb with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd outfitted senators and CEOs and apparently now mechanics being drafted into high society for a single night. Victoria stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. You don't have to stay for this, Caleb said, catching her eye in the mirror. I want to make sure it's right, she said. This isn't about vanity, Caleb. It's armor. If you look like you belong, half the battle is already won before anyone opens their mouth. I thought the whole point was that I don't belong. That's why you picked me. There's a difference between not belonging by choice and not belonging because you couldn't afford the entry fee, Victoria said. I want them to see a man who chose not to play their game, not a man who couldn't play it if he tried. Mr. Petrosian finished pinning the jacket and stepped back, and for a moment, Caleb looked at himself in the mirror. Dark charcoal suit, tailored close, nothing flashy but undeniably sharp, and didn't quite recognize the man staring back. You clean up well, petty officer, Victoria said quietly, using his old rank for the first time, and something about the way she said it, not mocking, almost respectful, settled something nervous in his chest. Don't get used to it, Caleb said. I'm going back to motor oil the day after. I wouldn't dream of asking you to change who you are. Victoria's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something almost vulnerable. That's the entire reason any of this might work. The night before the wedding, Caleb sat on the edge of Emma's bed, after tucking her in the suit, hanging in a garment bag in his closet like something waiting to be deployed. Emma was half asleep already, but she caught his hand before he could stand up. Dad? Yeah, baby. Remember what you're gonna do if they're mean. Caleb smiled in the dark. I remember. Remember who you are. That's right. Okay. She yawned, already drifting. Then you'll be fine. You're the bravest dad I know. I already said that, but I'm saying it again, 'cause it's important. Caleb sat there a long time after her breathing evened out into sleep, replaying her words, letting them settle into the part of him that had spent the last 9 days quietly terrified of walking into a room built to remind him of every door that had ever been closed to people like him. Remember who you are. Simple enough for an 8-year-old to say without hesitation. Hard enough somehow for a grown man to believe walking into a room full of people who'd already decided the answer for him. He thought about Victoria Langley too, in the quiet of that dark hallway, a woman who'd built an empire out of nothing and still couldn't walk into her ex-fiancé's wedding without hiring a stranger to stand beside her, because somewhere underneath $400 million was a person just as unsure of her place in the room as he was. Maybe that was the thing neither of them had said out loud yet. They weren't so different, the CEO and the mechanic. They'd both spent their whole lives being underestimated by people who mistook quiet strength for absence of power. Tomorrow, that room was going to find out how wrong it had been about both of them. Caleb turned off the hallway light, and went to check on his suit one more time before trying and mostly failing to sleep. The morning of the wedding arrived gray and still, the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, like the whole world was holding its breath along with him. Caleb woke before his alarm, lay in the dark for a long moment listening to the house settle around him, and then got up and made coffee he barely tasted. Marissa arrived at 7 to watch Emma for the day, letting herself in with the spare key she'd had since Rachel's funeral, back when showing up without being asked had become the only way any of them knew how to survive that first year. "Let me look at you," she said the moment she saw him standing in the kitchen, in his undershirt and slacks, suit jacket still hanging upstairs. "I haven't even put the jacket on yet." "Doesn't matter. I want to see my brother's face before the nerves take over." She studied him with the same sharp assessment she'd used since they were kids, back when she'd always been able to tell if he was lying about being fine. "You look terrified." "I look focused. You look terrified wearing a focused face." Marissa poured herself coffee. She hadn't asked permission for comfortable in his kitchen the way only family could be. "Talk to me. What's actually going on in your head right now?" Caleb leaned against the counter, arms crossed, staring at nothing in particular. "I keep thinking about the fact that I've walked into actual combat zones with less prep than I've done for one dinner party." "This isn't a dinner party, Caleb. You told me yourself, 400 people, senators' cameras. That's not a dinner party, that's a controlled demolition waiting for a reason to happen." "Thanks, very comforting." "I'm not here to comfort you. I'm here to make sure you walk in with your eyes open." Marissa set her mug down and crossed her arms, mirroring him. "You really don't know her. Not really. 9 days isn't enough time to know somebody, and you're about to stand next to this woman in the worst moment of her adult life, in front of everyone who's ever made her feel small. That's not a small thing to ask a stranger to carry." "I know. Do you?" "Because from where I'm standing, my brother, who still hasn't cried in front of another human being since Rachel died, who still can't say the word lonely out loud without changing the subject, is about to spend an entire evening being somebody's emotional armor. I just want to make sure you're doing this because it's the right thing to do, and not because some part of you misses being needed." Caleb didn't answer right away. The question landed somewhere he hadn't expected it to, somewhere underneath the tuition, and the number on the check somewhere he hadn't let himself look too closely at. "Maybe it's both," he finally admitted. "Does that make it wrong?" Marissa's expression softened. "No, it just makes you human." She reached over and straightened his collar, an old habit from when he was younger, and she was the closest thing he had to a mother most days. "Just remember something for me while you're in that room tonight." "What's that?" "You don't owe anybody a performance. Not her, not those people, not even yourself. Whatever happens tonight, you go in exactly as you are, and if that's not enough for somebody in that room, that's their failure of imagination, not yours." Caleb thought of Emma saying almost the same thing 3 nights earlier, and something in his chest loosened slightly. "You and my daughter should compare notes. You're saying the same things." "Good. Means we're both right." Marissa smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Now go get dressed before I start crying and ruin the whole morning." Emma found him in the hallway an hour later, fully dressed, fastening his cufflinks with hands that were steadier than he felt. She stopped in the doorway of his bedroom, eyes wide, taking him in like she was seeing someone entirely new, standing in her father's usual spot. "Dad," she said slowly, "you look like a movie." Caleb laughed low and genuine, the first real laugh of the morning. "Is that good or bad?" "Good. Definitely good." She walked closer, reaching up to touch the lapel of the jacket, like she needed to confirm it was real. "You look like somebody important." "I'm not important, baby. I'm just wearing a nice suit." "No," Emma said with the stubborn certainty only a child possessed. "You're important even without the suit. The suit's just letting other people see it today." Caleb knelt down to her eye-level throat tight in a way he hadn't expected. "When did you get so smart?" "I've always been smart. You just don't notice 'cause you're always busy." She said it without malice, simple observation, and it landed somewhere soft and guilty in his chest anyway. "I notice," he said quietly. "I notice everything about you." Emma wrapped her arms around his neck, careful not to wrinkle the jacket, an instinct so thoughtful it nearly broke him. "Be brave tonight," she whispered against his ear, "but not too brave. Come home after." "I promise," he said, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in the last 4 years. The car Victoria sent arrived at 4 in the afternoon, black and silent, driven by a man who didn't attempt small talk, which suited Caleb fine. He sat in the back seat watching his neighborhood give way to unfamiliar streets, watching the houses grow larger and the lawns grow wider the closer they got to the Ashcombe estate, until eventually there were no houses at all, just long stretches of manicured land behind iron gates that looked like they'd been standing since before his grandfather was born. Victoria was waiting for him at a private staging area near the estate's guest entrance in a black gown that managed to look both simple and devastating at once. No visible effort in it anywhere except the effort of choosing exactly the right kind of understatement. She looked, Caleb thought, like a woman who had spent hours deciding how to look like she hadn't spent any time deciding at all. "You look good," she said when he stepped out of the car, her eyes doing a quick, professional assessment before settling on his face. "Mr. Petrosian earns his money." "It's not the suit." Victoria's voice was quieter than he expected. "You look like you belong in it. That's harder to buy." Caleb glanced past her toward the estate grounds already visible in the distance. White tents, strings of lights not yet lit against the fading afternoon, a fountain in the center courtyard that probably cost more than his house. "This is a lot," he admitted. "It's meant to be." Victoria straightened the sleeve of his jacket, an unnecessary adjustment that felt more like something to occupy her hands than an actual correction. "Everything here is designed to remind you that you're small and they're not. That's the entire architecture of a place like this. Good thing I don't scare easy. I'm counting on that." She looked at him, then really looked something searching in her expression. "Last chance to walk away, Caleb. I mean that. If any part of you wants out, now is the moment. Once we walk through those doors, there's no quiet exit." Caleb held her gaze steady. "I don't walk away from a job halfway through. Never have." Something in Victoria's shoulders dropped just slightly, the tension of the last 9 days finally finding somewhere to settle. "Then let's go remind them who I am." They walked toward the entrance together, and Caleb felt the shift the moment they crossed some invisible threshold. The air itself seemed to change thicker with perfume and old money, and the particular hush of people who'd trained their whole lives to notice everything while pretending to notice nothing. The first hour moved slower than Caleb expected. Cocktail hour. Victoria had called it, though nothing about the atmosphere felt casual enough to deserve the word cocktail. Servers moved through the crowd with trays of champagne flutes and small architectural appetizers that looked more like art than food. And everywhere, Caleb turned conversations paused for half a beat too long when he and Victoria passed by. "Victoria Langley," a woman said, materializing at Victoria's elbow with the practiced smoothness of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of the casual ambush. She was older, silver-haired, dressed in a deep emerald that made her look like she'd been carved from something expensive. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come. Why wouldn't I, Diane?" Victoria's voice was smooth, unbothered, though Caleb noticed the slight tightening at the corner of her mouth. "Evelyn and I remain on good terms." "Of course." Diane's eyes slid to Caleb, cataloging him with the swift, dismissive efficiency of someone checking an unfamiliar name off a guest list she hadn't approved. "And this is Caleb Walker," Victoria said before Caleb could answer for himself. "My guest." "Your guest?" Diane repeated it like the word itself was slightly distasteful, a foreign object she was testing with her tongue. "How lovely. And what is it you do, Mr. Walker?" "I work on cars," Caleb said, simply. No elaboration, no apology in it. Diane blinked clearly, expecting a different kind of answer. Something with a title attached, a company name, an Ivy League affiliation. "How practical." She finally managed the pause before the word doing most of the insulting for her. "It is." Caleb agreed, unbothered, and something about his refusal to be embarrassed seemed to throw the woman off balance more than any defensive response could have. "Well," Diane said, recovering with visible effort, "I'm sure you'll find plenty to talk about with the catering staff." She smiled thinly and drifted away before Victoria could respond, already scanning the room for her next target. Victoria exhaled slowly once the woman was out of earshot. "I'm sorry about that." "Don't be." Caleb took a glass of water from a passing tray, ignoring the champagne. "I've had worse insults from people who at least had the decency to say them to my face, instead of hiding behind a compliment." "That's just the opening act," Victoria warned quietly. "It gets worse the closer we get to the ceremony. Once people realize I actually brought someone real, instead of hiding behind a business associate or a hired escort, the questions get sharper." "I can handle sharp. I know you can. That's why you're here." Victoria's eyes drifted almost involuntarily toward a cluster of people near the fountain, and Caleb followed her gaze to see a woman standing among them, golden-haired, luminous even from a distance, laughing at something with the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted her place in a room like this. "That's her," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. "That's her." Victoria's voice had gone very quiet, very controlled, the sound of someone holding an enormous weight steady through sheer force of will. "Evelyn Whitmore, soon to be Evelyn Ashcombe." Caleb studied the woman across the courtyard, trying to reconcile the laughing figure in white with the ghost that had apparently haunted every conversation he'd had with Victoria for the last 9 days. She looked from this distance almost ordinary, beautiful, certainly, but not otherworldly. Not the mythic figure Victoria's careful restraint had built her into. "She doesn't look like she's thinking about you at all," Caleb offered. "She's not right now." Victoria's jaw tightened. "But she will be the moment she sees us." As if summoned by the observation itself, the woman across the courtyard turned, and her eyes found Victoria's with an immediacy that suggested she'd been aware of the exact location of every person who mattered in that room, the entire time, laughter or no laughter. Her smile didn't falter, but something behind it sharpened, focused the way a predator's expression changed the instant it spotted movement in the grass. "Here we go," Victoria murmured almost to herself. Evelyn crossed the courtyard with unhurried grace, the small crowd around her parting instinctively, the way rooms always seemed to part for people who'd never once had to ask them to. "Victoria," Evelyn said, arriving in front of them, with a smile so perfectly calibrated it could have been measured with instruments. "You actually came. I wasn't sure you would." "I said I would," Victoria replied, her voice a careful match of pleasant and impenetrable. "You know I keep my word. I remember." Something flickered behind Evelyn's eyes, not quite malice, but close to it, dressed up in the language of nostalgia. Her gaze shifted to Caleb, sliding over him with the same appraising sweep Diane had used, though sharper, more deliberate. "And you brought a friend." "Caleb Walker," Victoria said. "Caleb, this is Evelyn." "Congratulations on the wedding," Caleb said, extending his hand. Evelyn shook at her grip light decorative, the handshake of someone who'd never had to grip anything harder than a champagne flute. How kind. Her eyes stayed on him a beat too long. Walker. I don't believe I've heard that name before. Are you in Victoria's industry? No, ma'am, I'm a mechanic. The word landed in the small circle of nearby conversation, like a stone dropped into still water. Caleb watched it ripple outward, a raised eyebrow. Here, a poorly concealed smirk. There, the particular silence of people recalibrating their assumptions in real time. A mechanic, Evelyn repeated, and her smile widened. Sweetened, took on the particular quality of someone who had just found exactly the thread she needed to pull. How refreshing. Victoria's always had a taste for the unexpected. I like to think I have a taste for what's real, Victoria said evenly. Of course you do. Evelyn's eyes flicked between them, cataloging something Caleb couldn't quite name. And here I was worried you'd bring someone from the board again. Do you remember Harold from the Q3 dinner 2 years ago, dreadfully boring man? At least this is interesting. Caleb's not interesting because he's unusual, Evelyn. He's interesting because he's honest. It's a quality this room seems to be running short on lately. The barb landed cleanly, and for just a moment something genuine flashed across Evelyn's composed face. Not quite anger, but close enough to it that Caleb caught it before she smoothed it back into practiced pleasantness. Well, Evelyn said, recovering with the ease of long practice, I should circulate. So many people to greet. Her eyes settled on Caleb one final time before she turned to leave. It was lovely meeting you, Mr. Walker. Do try to enjoy yourself. I know this world can feel rather overwhelming for people who aren't accustomed to it. She left before Caleb could respond, drifting back into the crowd with the same effortless grace she'd arrived with, leaving a faint trail of unease behind her. Caleb turned to Victoria, who was watching Evelyn's retreating figure, with an expression he couldn't fully read, something between old grief and fresh anger tangled together in a way that looked exhausting to carry. She's good, Caleb said quietly. She's had a lifetime of practice. Victoria's voice was tight. That's what these people do, Caleb. They don't yell. They don't threaten. They just find the smallest crack in your composure and press on it gently, repeatedly, until you either break or leave the room. She's just getting started. Let her try. Victoria looked at him, then something like gratitude flickering across her guarded expression. You handled that better than most people would have. I've had worse than a rich woman calling me a mechanic like it's an insult. Caleb's voice stayed even, unbothered. Some of the best men I ever served with fixed engines for a living before they fixed people's problems overseas. I've got nothing to be ashamed of. I know, Victoria said. I just wasn't sure the room would agree with you. The room doesn't have to agree with me. I know who I am. He said it simply, without performance, and something about the certainty in his voice seemed to settle something in Victoria, some doubt she'd been carrying since the moment they'd walked through the gates. The evening moved forward in stages. Cocktail hour bleeding into the formal seating, the ceremony itself looming an hour away, the crowd growing thicker and louder as more guests arrived. Caleb stayed close to Victoria's side, throughout, watching, listening, cataloging the room. The way he'd once cataloged unfamiliar terrain, learning which faces carried real threat and which were simply curious. A man in his 60s approached them near the edge of the courtyard, silver-templed and broad-shouldered, wearing the kind of easy authority that came from decades of being obeyed without question. Victoria. His voice carried none of the elegant cruelty Evelyn had used, but something colder underneath the politeness. I wondered if you'd have the nerve to show up. Father. Victoria's spine straightened almost imperceptibly, her whole posture shifting into something more guarded. I didn't realize the Ashcombs had invited you personally. Or is this just an extension of your usual habit of attending events uninvited? Warren's father and I have known each other for 30 years. I was invited long before this wedding was ever announced. His eyes moved to Caleb, assessing, dismissive in the same clinical way Diane's had been, though with a harder edge underneath it. And who is this? Caleb Walker, my guest. Victoria's father Caleb hadn't caught a name, and somehow it didn't feel necessary. Looked him over slowly, the way a man might examine a used car he had no intention of buying. "Walker, do I know your family?" "I doubt it, sir," Caleb said evenly. "I'm not from a family you'd have crossed paths with." Something flickered in the older man's expression, distaste thinly veiled beneath politeness. How refreshingly direct. He turned his attention back to Victoria. "I'll say what I came to say, and then leave you to your evening. You look thin. You're working too hard as usual, chasing something that will never fill the hole you keep insisting isn't there." "I'm fine, Father." "You're always fine, Victoria. It's the one performance you've never learned to drop." His gaze flicked briefly dismissively back toward Caleb. "Bringing a mechanic to Evelyn's wedding. I suppose that's meant to be some kind of statement." "It's not a statement," Victoria said, voice tightening. "It's a choice. Something you've never understood I'm allowed to make. A choice that will be the talk of this room by morning, and not in the way you're hoping." He straightened his cuffs with a small dismissive motion, already turning to leave. "Try not to embarrass yourself further tonight. It reflects poorly on more than just you." He walked away without waiting for a response, disappearing into the crowd, with the same unhurried authority he'd arrived with, leaving Victoria standing rigid beside Caleb. Her jaw clenched tight enough that Caleb could see the muscle working beneath her skin. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "I've had 20 years of practice being okay after conversations like that." Victoria's voice was clipped, controlled, but her hands had curled slightly at her sides. "He's never once told me he was proud of anything I've built. Not the company, not the money, not the buildings with my name on them. All he sees is a daughter who didn't marry well and didn't stay married to the one person who almost made him approve of her." Caleb watched her carefully, the way she held herself together through sheer discipline, and thought of every commanding officer he'd ever served under, who'd mastered the same trick, holding the whole unit steady by refusing to let their own cracks show, even when the pressure built high enough to break bone. "For what it's worth," Caleb said, "I don't think you need his approval to have built something real." Victoria looked at him, something raw flickering behind her controlled expression, before she pulled it back into place. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Most people in my life just tell me what I want to hear. You don't do that, do you?" "Never have. Doesn't seem worth the effort of lying." A small, genuine smile broke through her composure for the first time all evening, brief but real. "That's dangerous in a room like this." "Good thing I don't scare easy," Caleb said again, and this time Victoria actually laughed, quiet, surprised, like she'd forgotten she still had that in her somewhere. The murmurs started not long after, threading through the crowd, the way rumors always did, in rooms built for gossip, disguised as conversation. Caleb noticed it first, in the way people's eyes lingered a beat too long when they passed, in the way small clusters of guests would fall quiet, and then erupt into hushed, urgent whispers the moment he and Victoria were out of earshot. "They're talking about us," he said quietly, leaning slightly toward Victoria as they moved toward the seating area for the ceremony. "They're talking about you," Victoria corrected. "Half the room is trying to figure out who you are, and the other half has already decided you're either staff who wandered into the wrong section or some kind of charity case I've taken on to look progressive. Neither one's true, I know. But truth's never been the priority in a room like this. Perception is." Victoria's voice carried a tired edge, the accumulated weight of years spent navigating exactly this kind of scrutiny. "By the time the ceremony starts, there will be at least 3 competing theories about who you are and why you're here, and none of them will be accurate." As if to prove her point, a young man in an impeccably tailored tuxedo sidled up beside them, champagne in hand, an easy, condescending smile already fixed on his face. "You must be the mystery guest everyone's talking about," he said, addressing Caleb directly, ignoring Victoria almost entirely. "Preston Ashcombe, Warren's cousin." He extended a hand, limp and perfunctory. "So tell me, are you hired help, or is this some kind of social experiment Victoria's running?" The question landed with deliberate cruelty, disguised as casual curiosity, and Caleb felt the muscles in his jaw tighten, though his voice, when he answered, remained perfectly level. "Neither," he said simply. "I'm her guest. That's all the explanation that's necessary." Interesting answer. Preston's smile didn't waver, but his eyes gleamed with something predatory, the look of someone who'd found a new form of entertainment for the evening. Very diplomatic, almost rehearsed. "It's not rehearsed, it's just true." "Of course." Preston's gaze slid over Caleb's suit, his posture cataloging him the way a jeweler might examine a stone he suspected was fake. "You know we don't get many people like you at events like this. Refreshing in its own way, like a documentary come to life." Victoria's expression hardened. "Preston, I'm only saying," Preston continued undeterred, "that it's admirable, really. Bringing someone from such a different world into ours shows real commitment to breaking down barriers or whatever it is people say these days." He raised his glass slightly toward Caleb in a mock toast. "Do try not to feel too out of place, Mr. Walker. I imagine all of this must be rather overwhelming for you." The circle of nearby guests who'd drifted close enough to listen went quiet, waiting the particular hush of an audience anticipating a reaction they could later dissect over brunch. Caleb held Preston's gaze steadily unhurried, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the younger man's smile falter slightly before he spoke. "I've stood on the deck of a ship in the middle of the ocean during a storm that nearly capsized us." Caleb said, his voice calm, measured, carrying just enough weight to cut cleanly through the ambient noise of the courtyard. "I've held a wounded friend together with my own 2 hands until the medevac arrived. I've buried my wife and raised my daughter alone since, and gotten up every single morning after to make sure she had breakfast before school." He paused, letting that settle. "Compared to all that, sir, a room full of people in expensive suits doesn't overwhelm me in the slightest." The silence that followed was absolute. Preston's practiced smile faltered, cracked slightly at the edges, clearly unprepared for an answer that refused to be embarrassed by the question. "Well," Preston finally managed, recovering with visible effort, "I suppose that's admirable." "It's not meant to be admirable," Caleb said. "It's just my life. You asked if I felt out of place. I don't. I know exactly who I am in any room I walk into. I'm not sure everyone here can say the same." He let the words hang there, deliberate, unhurried, and watched something shift in the small crowd around them, a few guests exchanging glances. Someone near the back, suppressing what looked suspiciously like a smile. The balance of the room, tilting almost imperceptibly. Preston opened his mouth to respond, found nothing adequate to say, and instead offered a stiff nod, before retreating into the crowd, his earlier confidence visibly dented. Victoria exhaled slowly beside Caleb, something like awe mixed with relief in her expression. "I've watched grown executives crumble under Preston's questions in board meetings," she said quietly. "You just dismantled him in under 30 seconds without raising your voice once." "I didn't do it to win anything," Caleb said. "I just told the truth. People like that don't know what to do when you refuse to be embarrassed by something that isn't actually embarrassing." Victoria studied him for a long moment, something new in her expression, not quite surprise, but close to it, the particular look of someone recalibrating everything they thought they understood about a person. "You're not what I expected," she admitted. "What did you expect? Someone I'd need to manage all evening, someone who'd need protecting from all this." She gestured vaguely at the courtyard, the guests, the enormous weight of everything surrounding them. "Instead, I think I might actually need you more than you need me tonight." Caleb allowed himself a small, tired smile. "That's what I'm here for." The chime of a small bell rang out across the courtyard, then signaling the guests toward the seating area for the ceremony, and the crowd began to reorganize itself into the ordered rows that would soon witness the very thing Victoria had spent 9 days bracing herself to survive. "Ready?" Caleb asked quietly, offering his arm. Victoria looked toward the aisle, toward the white chairs arranged beneath strings of lights, not yet fully dark enough to shine toward the life she'd once imagined, standing at the front of that aisle herself, years ago, before everything had shifted into something else entirely. "No," she admitted, honest for the first time in a way that felt startlingly unguarded. "But let's go anyway." She took his arm, and together they moved toward the rows of white chairs toward the ceremony that was about to test everything Caleb had promised his daughter he'd remember: who he was, what he stood for, and the simple, stubborn refusal to let a room full of strangers decide his worth for him. Somewhere ahead, past the rows of expensive suits and careful smiles, Evelyn Whitmore was preparing to walk down an aisle toward the exact kind of life Victoria had once believed they would build together. And somewhere behind that same aisle, a woman who ran an empire sat rigid beside a mechanic, in a borrowed world, gathering the last of her composure for whatever the ceremony was about to demand of both of them. The seats filled quickly once the bell finished ringing. 400 bodies settling into rows of white chairs with the particular rustle of expensive fabric and quiet, practiced whispering. Caleb held Victoria's chair for her before taking his own beside her close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and he felt the tension radiating off her like heat off pavement in August. "Breathe," he murmured low enough that only she could hear it. "I am breathing." "You're doing that thing where you hold it in your chest and pretend it's normal. I've seen guys do that right before they go into a room they're not sure they'll walk back out of." Caleb kept his eyes forward, voice steady. "In count of 4. Out count of 4. Nobody in this row will notice." Victoria didn't answer, but a moment later he felt her shoulder ease down slightly, her breathing slowing to something closer to even. She didn't thank him for it. She didn't need to. The string quartet near the front shifted into something soft and anticipatory, and the murmur of the crowd thinned into a hush. Caleb glanced sideways at Victoria and watched her face go carefully, deliberately blank. Not empty, but locked down, every muscle disciplined into stillness, the way soldiers learned to hold formation under fire. "You don't have to watch if you don't want to," he said quietly. "Nobody's grading you on eye contact." "They are," Victoria whispered back, barely moving her lips. "Every camera in this courtyard is aimed at guests' reactions right now, not just the aisle. If I look away, it's a headline tomorrow. Langley couldn't bear to watch. If I cry, it's worse. If I smile too much, they'll say I'm performing. There's no version of this where I'm not being read. Then don't perform for them. Just watch the part that's real and let the rest of your face do whatever it wants." Victoria exhaled slowly, and something in her posture settled, not relaxed exactly, but steadier, like she'd found a foothold in unstable ground. The doors at the far end of the aisle opened, and the crowd rose as one organism, the rustle of 400 people standing at once, filling the courtyard like a held breath finally released. Caleb stood with them, offering his arm, without being asked, and Victoria took it. Her grip tighter than it needed to be. Evelyn appeared framed in the doorway, and even from this distance, even braced for it. Caleb heard the small, sharp intake of breath beside him. Victoria's composure cracking for exactly 1 second before she caught it and sealed it shut again. Evelyn was without question breathtaking, a gown that probably cost more than Caleb's truck hair, arranged with architectural precision, a bouquet of white flowers that trembled almost imperceptibly in her hands as she began the long walk down the aisle. She didn't look at Victoria as she passed. She didn't look at Caleb either. Her eyes stayed fixed forward toward the altar, toward Warren Ashcombe, standing tall and confident in his tailored black suit, toward the life she had chosen instead of the one she'd left behind. Caleb felt Victoria's hand tighten further on his arm, her nails pressing crescents into the fabric of his sleeve, and he covered her hand with his own, briefly steadying before letting go, so it wouldn't be noticed by the cameras Victoria had warned him about. "You're doing fine," he whispered. "I don't feel fine." "Doesn't matter what you feel. Matters what you show. You're showing steady. That's enough." The ceremony unfolded the way ceremonies do. Vows exchanged in careful, rehearsed voices. A minister's words about commitment and legacy that seemed aimed as much at the assembled dynasties as at the couple themselves. The exchange of rings catching light from the strings overhead as the sky finally darkened into true evening. Caleb watched Victoria throughout more than he watched the ceremony itself, monitoring her the way he used to monitor vitals on a wounded man, watching for the moment things might tip from controlled to critical. She held it together. Barely, but she held it right up until the minister pronounced them married, and the crowd rose into applause, and Evelyn turned radiant toward her new husband for the first kiss of their marriage. That was the moment Victoria's mask slipped. Not dramatically, not with tears, but with a small involuntary flinch, barely visible, unless you were looking directly at her, which Caleb was. He didn't say anything. He just shifted his weight slightly, closing the distance between them by an inch, a silent signal that he'd noticed, and it didn't matter that she wasn't alone in the moment, even if everyone around her assumed she was. The reception moved to a different part of the estate, a ballroom with ceilings high enough to make Caleb's neck ache slightly from looking up at the chandeliers, and Victoria's composure remarkably held through the transition. Polite nods, brief exchanges, the careful choreography of a woman determined to prove she could survive this room without cracking. It lasted through dinner. It lasted through the first round of toasts, delivered by Warren's best man, with practiced charm and just enough self-deprecating humor to earn polite laughter from the crowd. It lasted right up until Constance Ashcombe rose from the head table with a champagne glass in hand, and the room quieted in the particular way rooms quieted for matriarchs who had earned decades of unquestioned authority. "I won't take long." Constance began, her voice carrying easily across the ballroom without any visible effort, the voice of someone who had never once had to raise it to be heard. "I simply want to say how proud I am to welcome Evelyn into this family. She has shown time and again an extraordinary understanding of what truly matters: legacy, dignity, the kind of quiet grace that can't be bought, only inherited or earned through genuine character." The words themselves were innocuous enough, the standard fare of wedding toasts, but Caleb felt Victoria go rigid beside him, even before Constance's eyes drifted deliberately, unmistakably toward their table. "I think we've all learned something important tonight." Constance continued her smile, serene, poisonous underneath its politeness. "That true worth isn't measured by what's written on a company letterhead, or by how many zeros follow a number in a bank statement. It's measured by choices, by the company we keep and what that company says about who we really are." A ripple moved through the room, heads turning subtly, eyes flicking toward Victoria and Caleb's table, with the particular hunger of an audience that had just been handed permission to stare. To Evelyn. Constance finished raising her glass higher, for finally finding a place and a partner worthy of who she's always been. The toast ended to polite applause, but the subtext hung in the air like smoke, unmistakable to everyone in the room who'd been paying attention. Caleb felt Victoria's hand curl into a fist beneath the table knuckles, white against the white tablecloth. "She wasn't talking about Warren," Victoria said quietly, once the applause died down and conversation resumed around them. "That whole toast was about me, about us, about tonight. I know. She just told 400 people that I don't understand what real worth looks like, and that Evelyn only found it after leaving me." Victoria's voice was tight, controlled, but Caleb could hear the tremor underneath it now, the crack finally beginning to show. "And she did it in a way sophisticated enough that if I react, I'm the one who looks unstable. That's the game, Caleb. That's how this world works. They can gut you in public and smile while they do it. And if you flinch, you're the one who looks broken." Caleb watched her carefully, saw the years of accumulated weight in her expression, the exhaustion of someone who had spent her entire adult life being tested by exactly this kind of elegant cruelty, and had never once been allowed to simply react like a normal human being. "You want to leave?" he asked quietly. "No." Victoria's jaw set, something hardening back into place behind her eyes. "If I leave now, she wins completely. I came here to prove I could stand in this room and not be destroyed by it. I'm not giving that up over one toast, no matter how sharp it was." "Then we stay," Caleb said simply. "And we don't give them anything else to work with." But the room, having tasted blood once, wasn't finished. Caleb felt it building throughout the next hour, like pressure ahead of a storm. The whispers grew bolder. The glances lasted longer, and small clusters of guests began finding excuses to drift near their table, fishing for reactions, hunting for cracks. A woman Caleb didn't recognize approached under the guise of admiring Victoria's dress, then pivoted smoothly into asking how someone in Victoria's position had met someone like Mr. Walker, her tone dripping with the kind of curiosity that wasn't curiosity at all, just cruelty wearing a friendlier mask. Victoria deflected it with practiced grace, but Caleb watched the toll it took, watched her spine grow more rigid with each successive assault disguised as small talk. Preston Ashcombe reappeared near their table twice more throughout the evening, each time attempting a different angle of the same humiliation he'd tried earlier, once suggesting loudly enough for nearby tables to hear that Caleb must be quite the conversation piece for Victoria's next board meeting, once asking with false innocence whether Caleb had ever actually been inside a building this nice before, or if this counted as a first. Caleb absorbed each attempt with the same steady composure, refusing to give Preston the reaction he was hunting for, but he could feel something building in his own chest now too, not quite anger, but something adjacent to it, a slow-burning recognition that this wasn't just about him anymore. Every jab aimed his way was really aimed at Victoria, at her judgment, at her right to bring whoever she chose into a room that had spent years deciding she didn't fully belong there either. The breaking point arrived just after 10, when the dancing had started and the champagne had loosened tongues enough that politeness began fraying at the edges. Caleb had stepped away from the table briefly to get Victoria a glass of water. She'd been nursing the same untouched champagne flute all evening, and he could see the exhaustion starting to show around her eyes, and by the time he returned, a small crowd had gathered near their table, drawn by something he hadn't witnessed the start of. A man Caleb didn't recognize, mid-40s, flushed with the particular confidence that came from one drink too many, stood a little too close to where Victoria sat, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "I just think it's fascinating," the man was saying, addressing the small cluster of onlookers, more than Victoria directly, "that a woman who's built one of the most respected companies in the state would bring a mechanic to an event like this. What's the strategy there exactly? Some kind of authenticity branding, trying to seem relatable to the working class before your next shareholder meeting." Victoria's expression had gone carefully neutral, the mask fully back in place, but Caleb could see the tightness at the corners of her eyes, the particular strain of someone absorbing hit after hit and running low on whatever reserve she'd started the evening with. "Mr. Harrington," Victoria said evenly, "I don't owe you or anyone here an explanation for who I choose to bring as my guest." "Of course not," Harrington said, smiling in a way that suggested the opposite of agreement playing to the small crowd that had gathered to watch. "I'm simply curious. It's not every day you see someone so far outside their element at an event like this. Must be uncomfortable for him, don't you think? Standing around all night, nothing to contribute to the conversation, watching everyone else discuss things he's got no context for." Caleb set the water glass down on the table, with deliberate calm, and stepped forward close enough that Harrington's smile faltered slightly at his sudden proximity. "I've contributed plenty tonight," Caleb said, voice even unhurried. "I just haven't needed to raise my voice to do it, unlike some people." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the small crowd, quickly suppressed, and Harrington's face reddened further this time, with something closer to real anger, instead of alcohol-fueled bravado. "I don't think I was talking to you," Harrington said, a harder edge entering his voice now. "You were talking about me," Caleb replied. "Loud enough for a dozen people to hear. Seems fair I'd have something to say back." "Careful," Harrington said, taking a half-step closer, close enough now that a few guests nearby had gone quiet, sensing something shifting in the air. "This isn't your world, friend. Men like you don't get to talk back to men like me in a room like this." The words hung there, ugly and unmistakable, stripped finally of the elegant camouflage the rest of the evening had used. A few guests nearby actually gasped, quiet but audible, the particular sound of an audience realizing the performance had crossed some invisible line, even they hadn't expected to see crossed tonight. Caleb didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't clench his fists or step backward or give Harrington any of the reaction the man was clearly hunting for. "Men like me," Caleb repeated, quiet, measured, letting the words settle into the small silence that had opened up around them. You mean men who spent 12 years defending the country that lets you stand in a ballroom and insult people who can't afford to fight back the way you think they should? Harrington opened his mouth to respond, but Caleb wasn't finished. You mean men who work with their hands, so people like you never have to think about how your cars run, or your houses get built, or your food gets grown, while you stand around deciding we're beneath the conversation. Caleb's voice never rose, never cracked, but something in it had gone very still, very precise. The tone of a man who had made peace with exactly who he was a long time ago, and had no intention of letting anyone in that ballroom take it from him now. You mean men who buried their wives and raised their daughters alone, and still show up to work every single day, because unlike you, we don't have the luxury of falling apart in public. The ballroom around them had gone almost entirely silent, now the small crowd having grown into something much larger, words spreading through the room the way it always did at events like this, drawing eyes from every direction. "I don't know what world you think I don't belong in, Mr. Harrington," Caleb continued, "but I've spent my whole life in rooms that decided I didn't belong before I even opened my mouth, and I've survived every single one of them. This room isn't any different. The only thing that's changed tonight is that I'm finally not the only person who's noticed how ugly people get when they think nobody's going to push back." Harrington's face had gone through several colors in the span of Caleb's response, landing finally on a deep, humiliated red. The confidence that had carried him into this confrontation completely evaporated under the weight of a silence he hadn't anticipated. "I didn't mean," Harrington started, but his voice had lost all its earlier bravado, shrinking under the attention of a room that had suddenly collectively turned to watch him instead of Caleb. "I think you meant exactly what you said," Caleb replied, still calm, still steady. "I just don't think you expected anyone to say it back to your face instead of laughing along." Nobody in the gathered crowd laughed now. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Somewhere near the back, Caleb caught sight of Constance Ashcombe watching with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between surprise and grudging reassessment. Harrington, visibly rattled, muttered something unintelligible and retreated into the crowd, disappearing toward the bar with the hurried gait of a man desperate to escape the attention he'd invited on himself. The silence that followed stretched for one long, suspended moment before conversation slowly resumed around the edges of the room, guests turning back to their own tables, their own drinks, their own small dramas. Though Caleb could feel the shift in the air, even as the ballroom noise returned, something had changed. Some balance had tipped, and he wasn't entirely sure yet in which direction. He turned to find Victoria staring at him, her expression unlike anything he'd seen from her all evening. Not the controlled CEO mask, not the guarded politeness she'd worn through every previous confrontation, but something raw and unguarded, and almost stunned. "Caleb," she said quietly, and it was the first time all night her voice had cracked even slightly. "I'm sorry," he said, lowering himself back into the seat beside her. "I know you told me not to react to provocation. That wasn't reacting. I don't know what that was. Don't apologize." Victoria's voice was still unsteady, but something in her eyes had shifted, some wall finally coming down. "I've watched grown men twice his age wilt in front of Harrington in boardrooms. I've watched him destroy people's careers with less effort than that. And you just stood there and dismantled him in front of half the room without breaking a sweat." "I didn't do it for the room," Caleb said. "I did it because he was wrong and somebody needed to say so." "I know." Victoria's hand found his on the table, resting there for just a moment longer than politeness required. "That's exactly why it mattered." The rest of the reception moved differently after that. Caleb noticed it almost immediately. The whispers hadn't stopped, but their character had changed. Curiosity now edged with something closer to respect, or at least caution. A few guests who'd been openly dismissive earlier in the evening now offered careful, measured nods when their eyes met his small acknowledgments of a shift they weren't quite ready to voice out loud. Evelyn found them near midnight, drifting away from the dance floor, with Warren still occupied by a cluster of his groomsmen, her expression harder to read than it had been at any point earlier in the evening. "I heard about the scene with Harrington," she said, approaching their table with careful, measured steps. Wasn't much of a scene, Caleb said evenly. Just somebody saying something they shouldn't have, and somebody else saying so. That's not how the room's telling it. Evelyn's eyes moved between Victoria and Caleb, something calculating behind her composed expression. The story spreading right now is that a Navy veteran just publicly humiliated one of the most powerful men in this room without raising his voice once. That's not nothing, Mr. Walker. People here don't forget things like that. I wasn't trying to make a name for myself, Caleb said. I was trying to defend someone who didn't deserve to be attacked all evening for bringing a person she trusts. Something flickered across Evelyn's face at that not quite guilt, but close to it gone as quickly as it appeared. She turned to Victoria, and for the first time all night her voice lost some of its careful, weaponized sweetness. "Can I speak with you alone?" she asked. "Just for a moment." Victoria hesitated, glancing at Caleb, who gave a small nod. "I'll be fine," he said quietly. "Go." The two women walked a short distance away toward the edge of the dance floor, close enough that Caleb could still see them, but far enough that their conversation was lost beneath the music. He watched Victoria's posture throughout rigid at first, then slowly incrementally softening as whatever Evelyn was saying continued. He couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. He'd spent enough years reading body language on deployment in hospital hallways, in rooms where the truth mattered more than what people said out loud, to recognize the shape of an old wound being acknowledged, even if it wasn't being fully healed. When Victoria returned a few minutes later, her eyes were slightly glassy, though her composure held. "What did she say?" Caleb asked quietly. "She said she was watching tonight, and that she saw what I brought into that room wasn't a strategy or a statement. She said she saw someone who actually respects me, standing beside someone who spent her whole life surrounded by people who only respected what she could give them." Victoria's voice wavered slightly. "She said Constance's toast was cruel, and she was sorry she didn't say something in the moment, but she didn't want to make her own wedding about old wounds. That's something, I guess." "It's not enough to undo 6 years," Victoria said, quieter now. "But it's more honesty than I've gotten from her in the last 4. Caleb studied her carefully, watching the exhaustion finally catch up with her. Now that the immediate threat had passed, the adrenaline of the evening's confrontations draining out and leaving something more tired and human in its place. "You did it," he said gently. "You walked in, you survived the room, and you didn't let any of them break you. Not Diane, not your father, not Preston, not Harrington, not even Constance's toast. You're still standing." "We survived it," Victoria corrected, looking at him with something new in her expression, something that hadn't been there at the start of the evening. "I couldn't have done tonight without you, Caleb. I mean that." Before Caleb could respond, a familiar voice cut through the ambient noise of the reception, sharp enough to draw attention from the surrounding tables. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Preston Ashcombe had returned, drink in hand, his earlier humiliation apparently forgotten, or perhaps simply fueled into something bolder by whatever he'd been drinking since. The mechanic and the CEO having a moment. Should we be expecting an announcement, or is this just for tonight's performance? The nearby tables quieted again, drawn once more toward the potential for drama, and Caleb felt Victoria stiffen beside him, bracing for another round of the evening's cruelty. But something had shifted in Caleb over the last hour. Some final patience worn thin by an evening of watching a good woman get quietly torn apart by people who'd never once had to earn anything they were born into. He stood unhurried and turned to face Preston, directly, the room's attention swinging toward them once more. "Preston," Caleb said, voice calm, but carrying clearly across the now quiet section of the ballroom. "I've let you take your shots at me all night because it costs me nothing to let a man like you feel powerful for a few minutes. But I think it's time somebody in this room said out loud what everyone's been too polite to mention." Preston's smile faltered slightly. "And what's that?" "That you've spent this entire evening trying to make yourself feel bigger by making other people feel small, and the only person in this room who actually needed that tonight was you." Caleb's voice remained level, but there was something unmistakably final in it now. Victoria built an empire from nothing. She's employed thousands of people, built things that outlast every party this family's ever thrown. And you've spent tonight trying to diminish her and me because neither of us needed your family's name to matter. That's not confidence, Preston. That's fear wearing a very expensive suit. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than anything that had come before. It spreading outward through the ballroom as the words settled into every corner of the gathered crowd. Preston stood frozen, drink still in hand, face draining of color, as 400 guests turned almost as one to watch him fail to find a response. And in that silence, Victoria Langley rose slowly from her seat beside Caleb, and for the first time all evening stepped forward to stand beside him, instead of behind her own careful composure, ready finally to say something she'd been holding back the entire night. Victoria's hand found Caleb's arm, not for support this time, but as though grounding herself before she spoke, the way a diver might steady themselves before stepping off a ledge they'd been circling all night. "Preston," she said, and her voice carried the same clarity Caleb's had trained by years of boardrooms into something that didn't need volume to command a room. "I've known your family for over a decade. I've sat across negotiating tables from your uncle, attended a dozen of your family's galas, written checks to causes your grandmother championed. And in all that time, I don't think I've ever said this plainly, so let me say it now in front of everyone." Preston's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, apparently having learned in the last 30 seconds that silence was safer than whatever he might say next. "You have spent this entire evening, and honestly every event I've ever watched you attend, treating cruelty like it's wit," Victoria continued. "You think condescension is charm. You think making other people small is the same thing as being important yourself. It isn't. It never has been. And the fact that this room has let you get away with it for so long says more about this room than it does about you." A few guests near the edge of the crowd exchanged glances, some clearly uncomfortable. Others Caleb noticed watching carefully, nodding almost imperceptibly, as though Victoria had finally voiced something they'd privately thought for years, but never had the standing or the courage to say aloud. "Caleb Walker." Victoria went on, turning now so her voice reached the wider circle of onlookers that had gathered. "Is not a charity case, not a branding exercise, not a curiosity for any of you to dissect over champagne. He is a man who has served this country, raised a daughter alone through the worst loss a person can survive, and shown more genuine character in one evening than most of the people in this room have shown in their entire lives." Her voice caught slightly, then steadied. "I didn't bring him here to prove a point to any of you. I brought him because he is one of the only people I have ever met who doesn't want anything from me except honesty. That is worth more to me than every name, every title, every zero in every account represented in this ballroom tonight." The silence stretched taut and electric, 400 people holding some collective breath, waiting to see where this would land. "So, if standing beside him tonight costs me anything with any of you," Victoria said, "then it was never a cost worth worrying about in the first place." She stopped there, chest rising and falling slightly faster than her usual controlled cadence, and for a moment, nobody in the ballroom moved. Preston stood frozen, drink still useless in his hand, his earlier bravado completely evaporated under the weight of a room that had just watched him get dismantled twice in one night by two different people who refused to shrink for him. Then from somewhere near the back of the gathered crowd, a single pair of hands began to clap, slow, deliberate, unmistakable, in the quiet. Caleb turned to see an older man he didn't recognize. Silver-haired, dressed with the same understated wealth as everyone else in the room, nodding slowly as he applauded. A few more guests joined, hesitant. At first, then more confidently, the applause spreading in uneven waves through pockets of the ballroom until it wasn't universal, but it was undeniable. A meaningful portion of the room had just chosen a side, and it wasn't Preston's. Preston, face burning red, muttered something inaudible and retreated toward the bar without another word, disappearing into the crowd the way Harrington had earlier, leaving behind a silence that felt for the first time all evening like it belonged to Victoria instead of against her. Victoria sank back into her seat once the applause faded, and conversation slowly resumed around the ballroom, her hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline of the moment had nowhere left to go. Caleb sat beside her, close quiet, giving her space to come back to herself. "I don't know where that came from," she admitted after a long moment, voice barely above a whisper. "I think it came from somewhere you've been keeping locked up for a long time," Caleb said gently. "Maybe." Victoria stared at her hand, still faintly unsteady in her lap. "I've spent years being diplomatic in rooms like this, careful, strategic, never giving anyone ammunition, never showing a crack they could use against me later. Tonight I just stopped caring about the strategy." "How's that feel?" She considered the question seriously, like it deserved an honest answer instead of a polished one. "Terrifying," she finally said. "And also the first time I've felt like myself in this world in longer than I can remember." Caleb allowed himself a small smile. "Good terrifying, or bad terrifying? I'm still figuring that out." Victoria looked at him, then something unguarded in her expression that hadn't been there at any point earlier in the evening. "Thank you, Caleb. Not just for tonight, for not treating me like something fragile that needed managing. Everyone in my life manages me. My board, my father, even Evelyn in her own way back when we were together. You just stood beside me. Let me be angry. Let me be honest. Nobody does that anymore." "You don't strike me as somebody who needs managing," Caleb said. "You strike me as somebody who's been surrounded by people who confused control for care for so long that you forgot the difference." Something in Victoria's expression cracked slightly at that, not quite tears, but closed the particular vulnerability of being seen more clearly than she was used to being seen. "That's a very perceptive thing to say for a mechanic," she said, voice thick with something between humor and emotion. "I fix things for a living," Caleb said. "Turns out people aren't so different from engines. Sometimes the problem isn't what everybody assumes it is on the surface." The reception wound down slowly. After that, the energy of the ballroom shifting from the sharp tension of earlier into something looser, more forgiving. As guests grew tired and champagne gave way to coffee, and the band eased into slower songs, meant to signal the evening's natural end. Caleb noticed the difference immediately in how people approached their table. Now fewer barbed questions, more genuine curiosity. A handful of guests even stopping by to offer quiet words of respect for how he'd handled both Harrington and Preston. One woman, elegant and reserved, paused at their table long enough to say, "I've watched Preston humiliate people at these events for 15 years. Nobody's ever stood up to him like that. Thank you." She moved on before Caleb could respond, leaving behind a small, unexpected warmth in his chest. Even Constance Ashcombe approached eventually, though her demeanor carried none of the warmth the other guests had shown. She stopped in front of their table, with the same regal poise she'd carried through her toast, studying Caleb with an expression that gave away nothing. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice cool measured. "That was quite the display tonight." "Wasn't trying to put on a display, ma'am. Just trying to make sure people said what they meant to my face instead of behind it." Constance's lips pressed into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You handled Preston and that Harrington man with more composure than most seasoned executives manage and far less pressure. I'll grant you that." Her eyes moved briefly to Victoria before returning to Caleb. "Whatever you are to Victoria, you're clearly not what this room expected. That's not nothing." "I appreciate that. I'm not offering a compliment, Mr. Walker. I'm making an observation." Constance's tone remained carefully neutral. "This world doesn't forgive easily, and it doesn't forget quickly either. Tonight will follow both of you one way or another. I simply hope for Victoria's sake that whatever this is between you is worth the scrutiny that's coming." She left without waiting for a response, moving back toward the head table with the same unhurried authority she carried everywhere. And Caleb watched her go, uncertain whether what she'd just said had been a warning, or, in its own guarded way, something closer to approval. "That's about as close to a blessing as you'll get from Constance Ashcombe," Victoria said quietly, watching the same retreating figure. "She's never once complimented anyone without qualifying it into oblivion first. Didn't feel much like a blessing. With her it never does. but trust me, if she'd disapproved, she wouldn't have bothered coming over at all. Near 1 in the morning, with the reception thinning into its final hour, Victoria excused herself briefly, and Caleb used the moment alone to step outside, needing air after hours of carefully controlled tension. He found a quiet terrace at the edge of the estate grounds, away from the noise of the ballroom, the night air cool and welcome after the thick perfume and champagne-soaked warmth inside. He pulled out his phone and saw a text from Emma sent hours earlier, probably typed with Marissa's help before bed. "Hope you're being brave, Dad. Love you. Come home safe." He typed back quietly, standing alone under the dark sky. "Almost done, baby. Being brave. Love you more." He was still holding the phone when he heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Victoria stepping out onto the terrace, having changed out of her heels at some point, holding them loosely in one hand, her bare feet silent against the stone. "Hiding?" she asked, a small, tired smile on her face. "Recharging," Caleb said. "There's a difference. Mind if I join you? I could use some recharging myself." "It's your terrace, technically. Well, the Ashcombs. But you know what I mean." Victoria laughed, quiet and genuine, and came to stand beside him at the railing, looking out over the dark expanse of manicured lawn, stretching toward the distant tree line. "Long night," she said. "Longest one I've had since I got out of the service, and that's including the year my wife died." Victoria glanced at him, something careful in her expression. "I'm sorry. I know I've kept you here longer than I originally promised. Don't apologize. I said I'd see it through, and I meant it." Caleb looked out at the darkness, hands resting on the stone railing. "Besides, tonight wasn't what I expected either." "What did you expect?" "Honestly, I thought I'd spend the whole night standing quietly beside you while rich people ignored me, and I'd collect a check at the end and go home to my daughter with a good story to tell my sister." He shook his head slightly. "Didn't expect to end up in 2 separate confrontations, or to watch you tell off Preston Ashcombe in front of half the state's elite." "Neither did I," Victoria admitted. "I've spent years training myself not to react to things like that. Tonight, something just broke loose. I think it's been building for longer than I realized." "How long?" Victoria considered the question seriously, staring out at the dark lawn. "Since Evelyn left, probably. Maybe longer than that, if I'm honest. I've spent so many years proving I belonged in rooms like this one that I forgot to ask myself whether I actually wanted to belong in them at all." Caleb turned slightly to look at her, the moonlight catching the exhaustion and something softer underneath it on her face. "And do you want to belong? I used to think I did." Victoria's voice was quiet, thoughtful. "I used to think if I just built enough, achieved enough, proved myself enough times, eventually, this world would stop making me feel like an outsider wearing a very expensive costume. Tonight, watching you refuse to shrink for any of them, I realized something." "What's that?" "You never once tried to earn their approval. Not with Harrington, not with Preston, not even with my father. You just stood there being exactly who you are and let them decide what to do with that." Victoria turned to face him fully now. "I've spent 20 years trying to earn approval from people who were never going to give it to me honestly, no matter what I achieved. You didn't need it at all. That's the difference between us, and honestly, it's the thing I think I needed to see tonight more than anything else." Caleb held her gaze, something quiet and significant passing between them in the dark. "You don't need their approval either, Victoria. You never did. You just needed somebody to remind you of that." Victoria's eyes glistened slightly in the moonlight, and for a moment Caleb thought she might actually cry, the exhaustion and release of the evening finally catching up to her all at once. But she held it together, the way she'd held everything together all night, and instead reached out and took his hand, holding it simply without any performance behind it. "Thank you," she said again, quieter this time, more personal than the gratitude she'd offered earlier in the ballroom. "Not for the confrontations, not even for defending me. Just for being honest with me from that first phone call to right now. Nobody in my life does that anymore. I forgot what it felt like." "You don't have to thank me for being honest," Caleb said. "That's just who I am. Doesn't cost me anything extra." "It costs some people everything," Victoria said. You'd be surprised how rare it actually is." They stood together in silence for a while, after that the sounds of the reception fading behind them, the cool night air settling around them like something protective, and Caleb found himself unexpectedly in no hurry to break the moment. "Can I ask you something?" he said eventually. "Of course." "Are you okay? Really okay, not the version you'd tell a boardroom?" Victoria considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I think I will be. Tonight was harder than I expected, and easier than I feared somehow at the same time. Watching Evelyn get married, watching her build the life I once thought we'd build together, it hurt more than I expected it to. But it also felt like closing a door I didn't realize I'd left open for 4 years. She looked at him. Having you here made all the difference. Not because you protected me from anything exactly. Because you reminded me what it feels like to stand next to someone who actually sees me instead of what I represent. Caleb nodded slowly, understanding something in that statement that resonated further than he expected it to. I know that feeling, or the absence of it anyway. After Rachel died, most people in my life either treated me like I was made of glass, or disappeared entirely because they didn't know what to say to a single dad who used to be a corpsman. Nobody just stood next to me and let me be whatever I needed to be that day. What did you need? Victoria asked quietly. Some days somebody to just exist beside me without trying to fix anything. Caleb's voice had gone softer now, more open than he usually allowed it to be with anyone outside his family. Grief doesn't need fixing. It just needs company. Victoria's grip on his hand tightened slightly, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them two people who'd both spent years surrounded by others and still somehow felt alone in the specific particular way that only certain kinds of loss could create. I should probably get back inside, Victoria said eventually, though she made no immediate move to do so. There are still people I should say goodbye to before we leave. Proper etiquette even after everything. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. She smiled at that something warm and genuine breaking through the exhaustion on her face. I know, she said. That's exactly the thing I keep noticing about you tonight. They returned to the ballroom a few minutes later, and the remaining hour passed more gently than anything that had come before it. A handful of guests approached them throughout, some offering genuine warmth, others simply curious enough to introduce themselves properly, now that the earlier drama had settled into something the room had apparently collectively decided to respect, rather than continue attacking. Evelyn found them once more, near the end of the evening, standing slightly apart from the thinning crowd Warren occupied elsewhere with his family for the moment. I wanted to say goodbye properly, Evelyn said, her earlier sharpness replaced by something quieter, more genuine. And to apologize again for how tonight went for the both of you. I should have said something when Constance gave that toast. I knew what she was doing and I let it happen because I didn't want to make a scene on my own wedding day. That was a failure on my part. You don't owe us an apology, Victoria said, though her voice carried less bitterness than it had earlier in the evening. I think I do, Evelyn said. Watching you tonight. Victoria, really watching you, not just glancing at you across a room the way I've done at every event since we split. I saw something I haven't seen from you in years. You looked like yourself. Not the version of yourself you built for board meetings and magazine covers. The version I fell for back before any of this. She gestured vaguely at the ballroom around them. I don't know what this is between you and Mr. Walker, but whatever it is, it's good for you. I can see that clearly enough. Victoria didn't answer immediately, something complicated moving behind her eyes. Thank you for saying that. I mean it. Evelyn's gaze shifted to Caleb. And thank you, Mr. Walker, for standing up to Harrington and Preston tonight. Half this room has wanted to say what you said for years and never had the nerve. You did something most of these people, myself included, have been too cowardly to do. Wasn't about nerve, Caleb said. Just seemed like somebody needed to say it out loud. Evelyn studied him for a moment longer, something like genuine respect settling into her expression. Take care of her, she said quietly, glancing briefly at Victoria before returning her eyes to Caleb. She's stronger than she lets people see, but everyone needs somebody in their corner who isn't trying to use them for something. That's the plan, Caleb said simply. Evelyn nodded once, a final quiet acknowledgement passing between the three of them, before she turned and made her way back toward her husband, disappearing into the crowd of guests still lingering at the edges of the reception. Victoria watched her go, something settling in her expression that Caleb hadn't seen from her all night. Not quite peace, but the beginning of something close to it. 4 years, Victoria said quietly. 4 years I've carried around every version of what I imagined she'd say to me if we ever spoke honestly again. And it turns out, the truth was so much simpler than anything I'd built up in my head. Sometimes it is, Caleb said. People build entire wars in their minds that the other person never actually intended to fight. Victoria looked at him, something thoughtful in her expression. You sound like you've thought about that a lot. Rachel used to say something similar, right before she got sick, actually. She said most of the fights we almost had in our marriage happened entirely in my head before I ever said a word out loud to her. Caleb's voice softened with the memory. She was usually right about things like that. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. Wiser than me most days. Caleb allowed himself a small, sad smile. I think about what she'd say about tonight honestly. About all of this. What do you think she'd say? Caleb considered the question carefully before answering. I think she'd say I did the right thing standing up for somebody who needed it. She always said dignity mattered more than approval. That standing your ground quietly was worth more than winning loudly. He paused. I think she'd also probably tease me mercilessly about ending up at a high society wedding in a suit that costs more than our old car. Victoria laughed soft and genuine, the sound easing something tight in Caleb's chest that he hadn't realized was still there. I would have liked her, I think. She would have liked you too, Caleb said, surprising himself slightly with how easily the words came. She had a talent for seeing past whatever people put on the surface. I think she would have seen exactly what I've started to see tonight. What's that? Caleb held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them in the quiet space of the winding down ballroom. That underneath all this, he said, gesturing slightly at the chandeliers, the lingering guests, the enormous weight of the world she inhabited. You're just somebody who's been fighting to be seen for exactly who you are, same as anybody else, same as me. Victoria's breath caught slightly, something vulnerable flickering across her carefully composed features. That's a very perceptive thing to say, she said quietly, echoing her words from earlier on the terrace, for a mechanic. I told you, Caleb said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. People aren't so different from engines. Sometimes you just need somebody willing to actually look underneath the hood instead of judging the paint job. They stood together in the thinning crowd, the reception finally beginning its natural collapse toward closing guests. Trickling toward the exits in 2s and 3s, the band packing away instruments, the strings of lights overhead beginning to feel less like spectacle and more like something quietly beautiful, now that the tension of the evening had finally fully released. Victoria glanced toward the exit, then back at Caleb, something new and tentative in her expression. Walk me out, she asked. Course, Caleb said, offering his arm the same way he had at the beginning of the evening, though everything about the gesture felt different now, less like duty, and more like something neither of them had quite named yet. They made their way toward the entrance together, past the last lingering clusters of guests, past Constance Ashcomb's watchful, unreadable gaze, past Victoria's father, standing stiffly near the exit, with an expression that suggested he had plenty left unsaid, but had chosen for once to hold his tongue. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet. The estate's grand entrance lit softly against the darkness, the black car Victoria had arranged waiting patiently at the curb. Thank you, Victoria said again as they reached the car, her hand still resting lightly on his arm. For everything tonight. I don't think I would have survived it without you standing beside me. You would have, Caleb said honestly. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, but I'm glad I didn't have to find that out from the sidelines. Victoria looked up at him, something unspoken and significant hanging in the space between them. The events of the entire evening. The confrontations, the toasts, the terrace conversation, the strange and unexpected intimacy that had grown between two people who'd started the night as strangers, settling into something neither of them had a name for yet. "I know tonight was supposed to be a job," Victoria said quietly. "One evening, one transaction done and finished by morning. But I don't think I want it to be that simple anymore." Caleb held her gaze, feeling something shift in his own chest that he hadn't expected to feel walking into this night, something he wasn't sure yet how to define, but wasn't ready to dismiss either. "Neither do I," he admitted quietly. The driver opened the car door, and Victoria hesitated for one more moment before stepping toward it, glancing back at Caleb with an expression caught somewhere between gratitude and something far more uncertain, far more fragile, far more real than anything the evening had demanded of either of them until now. Caleb didn't move right away. He stood there on the gravel drive, watching Victoria pause with one hand on the open car door, and something in him, some old instinct that had kept him alive through firefights and funerals alike, told him this was a moment that mattered more than either of them had planned for. "Victoria," he said. She turned back. "Whatever this is," Caleb said, choosing his words carefully, the way he chose everything. "I don't want it to end because the night's over and the driver's waiting. I've got a daughter at home who needs me there in the morning, and you've got a company that probably needs you back at your desk by 7. But I don't want to pretend tonight was just a transaction either. Not after everything that happened in there." Victoria studied him for a long moment, the porch lights of the Ashcombe estate throwing soft gold across her face, stripping away for just a second every trace of the armored CEO who'd walked through those gates 6 hours earlier. "Then don't pretend," she said quietly. "Ride with me part way. There's a diner about 20 minutes from here that's open all night. I haven't eaten a real meal in about 8 hours, and I don't think either of us is ready to just say goodnight yet." Caleb almost laughed. "A CEO wants to go to a diner at 1 in the morning. A CEO wants pancakes." Victoria corrected something lighter, finally breaking through her exhaustion. "And honestly, after tonight, I don't think I can stomach one more room with a chandelier in it." "Pancakes I can do," Caleb said, and got in the car beside her. The diner was small, fluorescent lit. The kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox nobody had used in years, sitting on a stretch of road that felt like it belonged to an entirely different world than the one they'd just left behind. Victoria slid into the booth across from him, still in her black gown, heels abandoned somewhere in the back of the car, looking simultaneously out of place and more comfortable than she had all evening. "This is the first time all night I've felt like I could actually breathe," she admitted, wrapping both hands around a mug of coffee the waitress had poured without asking. "Funny how that works," Caleb said. $400,000 worth of flowers and champagne and a $2 cup of diner coffee is what finally does it. It's not the coffee. Victoria looked at him over the rim of the mug. "It's not having to perform for anyone. You don't ask me to be anything in particular. That's rarer than you probably realize. I don't have the energy to ask people to be anything but themselves," Caleb said. "Never have. Takes too much effort to keep up a performance, and I've got a daughter who'd see right through it anyway." Victoria smiled, small and tired and real. "Tell me about her. Emma, right?" Caleb's whole posture shifted at the mention of his daughter, something warm loosening in his chest. "She's 8, sharper than me most days. She told me before I left tonight to be brave, but not too brave, and to come home after." He shook his head, still faintly amazed by it. "She's the reason I said yes to any of this in the first place. Not the money, not really. The money was just what made it possible to say yes to something I probably would have turned down otherwise." "Why would you have turned it down?" "Because rich strangers asking single dads to escort them to high society weddings usually don't end well for the single dad," Caleb said dryly, and Victoria laughed, surprised. The sound loosening something in her shoulders that had been tight since the ceremony began. "Fair point, but..." Caleb continued, more serious now. "I think some part of me recognized something in your voice on that first phone call. Something underneath the CEO tone. I've heard that same thing in my own voice some mornings right after Rachel died when I was trying to sound like I had it together for Emma's sake, and I absolutely didn't. Victoria's expression softened, something vulnerable moving behind her eyes. You heard that on one phone call. I've had a lot of practice hearing what people don't say out loud, Caleb said. Occupational hazard, I guess. You learn to read what's underneath the words when you've spent years around people who can't afford to say what they're actually feeling. Victoria was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee mug slowly on the table. I haven't told anyone the real reason I asked you specifically out of everyone I could have hired for tonight. I thought it was the video, the house fire. That's part of it. But there's more. She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. I watched that video a dozen times before I ever called you, and every time what struck me wasn't just that you ran into a burning house for a stranger. It was the look on your face afterward when the reporter asked why you did it. You looked unbothered, like it never occurred to you there was another option, like doing the right thing wasn't heroic to you, just automatic. Her voice grew quieter. I've spent my whole adult life surrounded by people who calculate every action for what it earns them. I wanted just once to stand next to somebody who didn't calculate anything at all. Caleb held her gaze, something in his chest tightening at the rawness in her voice. I don't know if I've ever thought about it that clearly before, but you're not wrong. I don't do things because of what they'll get me. Never have. Guess that's just how I'm built. It's rare, Victoria said. Rarer than you know. And tonight, watching you refuse to bend for any of them, Harrington Preston. Even my own father. I realized something about myself I've been avoiding for years. What's that? That I've built an entire empire trying to prove my worth to people who were never actually capable of seeing it clearly in the first place. My father. Evelyn's old world. Even in some ways Evelyn herself before everything fell apart between us. Victoria's voice wavered slightly, the exhaustion of the night finally cracking something open that she'd clearly kept sealed for years. I kept thinking if I built enough, achieved enough, made myself undeniable enough, eventually, they'd have no choice but to respect me. Tonight I understood that respect built on other people's approval was never real respect at all. It was just exhaustion wearing a nicer name. Caleb reached across the table, not grabbing her hand exactly, just resting his own near enough that she could close the distance if she wanted to. She did, her fingers curling around his steady, in a way her voice hadn't quite managed to be. You don't need anybody's approval, Victoria, Caleb said quietly. Not your father's, not Constance's, not anybody's in that ballroom tonight. You built something real. Thousands of people have jobs because of what you created. That matters whether or not some silver-haired matriarch decides to acknowledge it in a toast. I know that logically, Victoria admitted. It's just harder to believe it in my chest than in my head. Give it time, Caleb said. That's not something that fixes itself in one night, no matter how good the pancakes are. She laughed again, softer this time, and something in the diner's fluorescent hum felt for a moment almost peaceful. They talked for almost 2 hours after that, long after the pancakes arrived and disappeared, long after the coffee went cold and got refilled twice. Caleb told her about Rachel, not the sanitized version he usually offered strangers, but the real one, the year of chemo and remission and relapse. The mornings Emma didn't understand why her mother slept so much the night Rachel had finally told him it was okay to let her go, and he hadn't been ready to hear it. Victoria listened without trying to fix any of it, without offering hollow condolences, just present, just there, the same steady company Caleb had described, needing during his own grief. In turn, Victoria told him things she'd apparently never said out loud to anyone about the years building the company alone after Evelyn left, about the panic attacks she'd hidden from her board for the first 18 months after the breakup, about a father who'd never once told her he was proud. Not when she graduated top of her class, not when she took the company public, not tonight, even after watching her stand up to an entire ballroom of people who'd underestimated her for years. He'll never say it, Victoria admitted, staring down at her coffee. I used to think if I just achieved enough, eventually he'd have to. I don't think that anymore. I think some people are just incapable of giving what you need from them, no matter how much you earn it. That's a hard thing to accept about a parent, Caleb said. It is, but it's honest at least. Victoria looked up at him. You gave me a lot of honesty tonight, Caleb. I think I owed you some back. By the time they finally left the diner, the sky outside had begun the faintest shift toward gray. The first suggestion of dawn still an hour off, but no longer impossible to imagine. The driver was waiting patiently outside, and Victoria walked Caleb to where his own car parked earlier at a lot near the estate, retrieved by the driver at some point during the evening's arrangements, sat waiting under a streetlight. I should let you get home, Victoria said. Emma's expecting you. She is. Caleb hesitated, hand on his car door, unwilling to simply drive off into the last hour of darkness without saying something more definite than the tentative, unfinished conversation they'd been having all night. Victoria? Yeah, I don't do this whatever this is casually. I've got a daughter who's already lost one parent to something neither of us could control. I'm not interested in bringing anybody into her life who isn't serious about staying in it. So if tonight was just gratitude or adrenaline, or the leftover intensity of surviving something hard together, I need you to tell me now before either of us gets in too deep to walk back cleanly. Victoria didn't answer right away, and Caleb respected her enough not to fill the silence, letting her actually think it through, instead of rushing her toward whatever answer might be easiest to give in the moment. I've spent 4 years protecting myself from exactly this kind of vulnerability, she finally said. Building walls high enough that nobody could get close enough to disappoint me the way my father has, the way Evelyn did. Tonight, for the first time since she left, I let somebody see all the parts of me I usually keep locked away. The anger, the exhaustion, the fear that maybe I really don't belong anywhere. And you didn't flinch from any of it. You didn't try to fix me, or manage me, or use any of it against me later. You just stayed. I'm good at staying, Caleb said quietly. Learned it the hard way. I know. Victoria stepped close enough now that Caleb could see the exhaustion and hope tangled together in her expression, the particular vulnerability of someone choosing to risk something after years of protecting herself from exactly this kind of risk. This isn't gratitude, Caleb. I'm not confused about that. This is the first time in longer than I can remember that I've wanted something for myself instead of for what it could prove to somebody else. Caleb held her gaze for a long moment, feeling the weight of the decision in front of both of them. The enormity of what it might mean to let this become something real, instead of a single strange, beautiful night, neither of them would ever fully explain to anyone else. Then let's find out what this is, he said. Slowly. No rush, no performance. Just honestly the way we did tonight. Victoria's smile, when it finally broke fully across her face, was unlike anything Caleb had seen from her all evening, unguarded, uncalculated, entirely her own. I'd like that, she said. The following weeks unfolded slower than either of them expected, and exactly as carefully as Caleb had insisted. Victoria called most evenings, sometimes just to talk about her day. Sometimes to ask almost shyly how Emma's week at school had gone, gradually working her way into the rhythm of Caleb's life, without ever forcing the pace. Caleb, in turn, found himself telling her things he hadn't told anyone since Rachel died. The fear that he wasn't raising Emma right without a mother in the house. The guilt he still carried over surviving deployments that had claimed better men than him. The small private hope he'd almost given up on, that maybe his life wasn't finished being good just because the hardest chapter of it was behind him. 3 weeks after the wedding, Victoria asked carefully if she could meet Emma. Only if you're ready, she said over the phone, her voice unusually uncertain for a woman who ran board meetings without breaking a sweat. I don't want to rush anything that matters this much. She already knows about you, Caleb admitted. Asks about you sometimes. Called you the wedding lady for the first 2 weeks, but I think she's upgraded you to Victoria now, which in Emma speak means you've officially been approved for further consideration. Victoria laughed, the sound warmer now than it had been even on the terrace that first night. High praise, apparently. Highest there is coming from her. They met at a park near Caleb's house on a Saturday afternoon. Nothing formal, nothing performative, just Victoria in jeans. Caleb had never imagined her owning sitting on a bench while Emma, cautious at first, sized her up with the same sharp assessment she'd apparently inherited from her father. "Are you really a CEO?" Emma asked after several minutes of careful observation from a safe distance. "I am," Victoria said, matching the child's seriousness without a trace of condescension. "Do you have a lot of money?" "I do." "Are you going to make my dad rich?" Victoria laughed, caught off guard by the directness. "That's not really how it works, sweetheart. But I'm not planning on making him poor either, if that helps." Emma considered this answer with visible satisfaction, apparently deciding it passed whatever internal test she'd been running. "Okay," she said, climbing up onto the bench beside Victoria without further hesitation. "Do you know how to braid hair? My dad's really bad at it. He always makes it lopsided. I happen to be excellent at braiding hair." Victoria said something soft and unguarded, breaking through her professional composure as she looked at the small, serious face beside her. "Want me to show you?" Caleb watched from a short distance away, throat tight, as Victoria Langley, CEO of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a woman who commanded boardrooms and had once stared down an entire ballroom full of people who doubted her, sat patiently on a park bench, carefully braiding his daughter's hair, with the gentle attentiveness of someone who had never once considered the task beneath her. That evening, after Victoria had gone home, and Emma was getting ready for bed, his daughter looked up at him with the particular seriousness she reserved for important pronouncements. "I like her dad." Yeah. She's not fake nice like some grown-ups are. She actually listens when I talk." Emma climbed into bed, pulling the covers up with satisfaction. "I think you should keep her." Caleb laughed, sitting on the edge of her bed. "It's not really up to me alone, baby. That's not how relationships work." "I know that," Emma said with the exaggerated patience of a child explaining something obvious to a slow adult. "I just mean, don't mess it up. You're not always great at people stuff. You're great at fixing cars and being brave, but people stuff, that's not really your strong suit." "Thanks for the vote of confidence." "You're welcome," Emma said, entirely sincere, already drifting toward sleep. "Good night, Dad. I'm glad you were brave at the wedding." Caleb sat there in the quiet dark of his daughter's room for a long time after her breathing evened out, thinking about everything the last month had brought into both their lives. The strange phone call, the reluctant agreement, the ballroom full of people who'd tried and failed to make him feel small, and now unexpectedly gently. Something that looked a lot like the beginning of a life he hadn't let himself imagine was still possible. 2 months after the wedding, Victoria invited Caleb to Langley Dynamics headquarters for the first time, not as a guest at some formal event, but simply to see the company she'd built, the empire that had cost her so much, and given her so much in equal complicated measure. She walked him through the floors personally, introducing him to employees not as my guest, the way she had at the wedding, but simply as Caleb, without qualification, without armor. "This is where it started," she told him, standing in a modest office on a lower floor that had clearly been preserved rather than renovated, the original space from the company's earliest, leanest days. "I kept this room exactly as it was. Reminds me where I came from whenever the higher floors start feeling like they belong to someone else." Caleb looked around the small space, a single desk, an old filing cabinet, a window with a view of nothing particularly impressive. "This is the room Evelyn worked 2 jobs to help you afford." "It is." Victoria's voice carried the weight of the memory without collapsing under it. "I used to come down here sometimes in the years after she left, just to remember that I built something real no matter how it ended between us. It helped some days. Other days, it just reminded me of everything I'd lost building it." And now, Victoria turned to look at him. Something steady and certain in her expression that hadn't been there the night of the wedding, hadn't fully been there even in the weeks since. "Now it just reminds me where I started, not where I'm stuck. There's a difference, and I don't think I understood that difference until you helped me see it." Caleb reached for her hand, and she let him take it. The gesture easy now, familiar in a way it hadn't been on that terrace 2 months earlier. "You built this," he said. "All of it. Nobody can take that away from you, not your father, not Constance Ashcombe, not anybody in that ballroom who ever doubted you belonged in a room like this one. I know that now, Victoria said. I think I've always known it somewhere underneath everything. I just needed somebody to remind me it was true, instead of somebody who needed me to keep proving it. That evening, Victoria came to Caleb's house for dinner. For the first time, nothing elaborate, just spaghetti. Emma had insisted on helping cook sauce splattered slightly across the kitchen counter. The three of them crowded around a small table that had for the last 4 years felt too big for just 2 people. This is way better than the wedding food, Emma announced, twirling pasta onto her fork with the confidence of a food critic. That stuff looked fancy, but I bet it didn't taste this good. You're probably right, Victoria said, smiling at the child across from her. Fancy doesn't always mean better. That's what Dad says about everything, Emma said. He says people who need fancy things to feel important usually don't feel very important on the inside. Victoria glanced at Caleb, something warm and amused passing between them. Your dad's a smart man. He's okay, Emma said, entirely deadpan, and Caleb nearly choked on his own pasta laughing. Later, after Emma had gone to bed and the kitchen had been cleaned, Caleb and Victoria sat together on the small back porch, the same kind of quiet settling between them that had first found them on the Ashcombe Terrace months earlier. Except now, it carried none of the uncertainty, none of the fragile newness of that first night. I keep thinking about something Constance said to me at the wedding, Victoria admitted, looking out at the dark yard. She said this world doesn't forgive easily, and it doesn't forget quickly, that tonight would follow both of us one way or another. Has it? In some ways. There are still whispers, still people who bring it up at events, curious about the mechanic who stood up to Preston and Harrington in front of half the state's elite. Victoria's voice carried no bitterness now, just quiet reflection. But I think what follows us matters less than what we actually built out of that night. Constance was right that the world doesn't forget. She just didn't understand that not everything worth remembering is something to be afraid of. Caleb reached over and took her hand, the gesture as natural now as breathing. What do you think they remember when they talk about that night? Victoria considered the question seriously. I think they remember watching someone stand up for himself and for someone else without needing anyone's permission to do it. I think whether they'd admit it out loud or not, most of that room walked away, wishing they had a fraction of that same courage. She turned to look at him. I think they remember watching me become someone I'd forgotten how to be, someone who didn't need their approval to know her own worth. And what do you think now, looking back? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars beginning to emerge over the modest backyard, so different from the manicured grounds of the Ashcombe estate, and somehow, in this quiet moment, infinitely more valuable to her than anything that world had ever offered. I think that was the night I stopped performing for a life I didn't actually want, she said finally. And started building one I did. Caleb pulled her closer, and for a long while, neither of them said anything else. The silence between them, comfortable now, earned through months of honesty, neither had expected to find in a stranger's phone call, 9 days before a wedding, that was never really about a wedding at all. Because in the end, that night hadn't been about proving anything to Evelyn Whitmore, or to Constance Ashcombe's carefully weaponized toasts, or to a father who would likely never offer the approval Victoria had spent decades chasing. It had never really been about the 400 guests in their expensive suits, or the chandeliers, or the old money trying to remind 2 people from different worlds exactly where they supposedly belonged. It had been about a single father who walked into a room full of strangers and refused to let anyone decide his worth for him, and a woman who watched that quiet, unshakable dignity and finally remembered how to reclaim her own. 2 people who had both spent years being underestimated by worlds that mistook their steadiness for weakness, finding in each other something neither had realized. They were still capable of believing in genuine respect, unhurried honesty, and the simple, powerful truth that real strength never needs an audience to prove it's real. And somewhere in that quiet backyard, far from any ballroom, any chandelier, any watching crowd, Victoria Langley finally understood what she had been searching for her entire life without knowing its name. Not power, not legacy, not approval from people who would never truly give it, but a steady hand beside her own, and the unshakable certainty that she had at last found exactly where she belonged.